Linton Kwesi Johnson's poem, The Great Insurrection. These are aimed primarily at modern and contemporary poetry second years, although obviously everybody is welcome. And this is a poem in Patois, the language of Jamaica and the Jamaican diaspora. I don't speak Patois, so there are obviously some limitations about the kind of close reading that I can do. Some nuance is going to be invisible to me. If you do speak Patois, maybe you can improve, enrich the kind of reading that is developed across these two videos through the comments or some other channel, as well as being words on the page, words on the screen. This poem kind of exists in other forms. It's dub poetry. It exists as a performance piece, sometimes with backing from musicians, and indeed it was released very shortly after the events that it describes as a track on an album. But to begin with, let's listen to it being read or performed without any music.
It was in April 1981, down in the ghetto of Brixton, that the Babylon them caused such a friction that it bring about a great insurrection. And it spread all over the nation. It was truly an historical occasion. It was the event of the year, and I wish I had been there when we run riot all over Brixton, when we mash up plenty police van, when we mash up the wicked one plan, when we mash up the swamp 81, fiwa, to make the ruler them understand that we not take no more of them oppression. And when me check out the ghetto grapevine, to find out all I could have find. Every rebel just a revel in them story. Them a talk about the power and the glory. Them a talk about the burning and the looting. Them a talk about the smashing and the grabbing. Them a tell me about the vanquish and the victory. Them said the Babylon them went too far. So we had was to burn 2 car. And 1 and 2 innocent get mar. But what? That's how it goes sometime in a war in Star. That's how it goes sometime in a war. Them say we burn down the judge, we could have burned the landlord. We burn down the judge, we never burn the landlord. When we run riot all over Brixton. When we mash up plenty police van. When we mash up the wicked one plan. When we mash up the swamp 81. Them say we commandeer car and we gather ammunition. We build with barricade and the wicked catch afraid. We send out we scout figure find them we're about. Then we farm up with posse and we make we raid. Well now them run gang go plan counter action. But the plastic bullet and the water cannon will bring a blam blam. Will bring a blam blam. Never mind scar man. Will bring a blam blam.
So a couple things to always look out for when you're close reading poetry, to think about, what voices are present. Is there a kind of speaker here? Often in modern and contemporary poetry, there isn't a speaker. In this case, I think there definitely is. There's a speaker, there's a narrative. But that doesn't mean that the voices are simple in this poem. So some of the other things that you might want to look out for are, where is there humor? Where is there maybe kind of reported speech? Does the speaker start kind of speaking in the voice of somebody else, relating their words? And maybe there's some bits where that is ultimately ambiguous, where that ambiguity about who is speaking and whether or not they're kind of relaying somebody else's speech, that ambiguity is part of the poem, part of what the poem is doing. So I thought I would just quickly run through some words that might potentially trip you up. Insurrection, just insurrection, uprising, a rebellion, often with a sense of kind of armed rebellion against an oppressive state power. An attempt at revolution. Friction in the context of this poem definitely meaning kind of social friction, social tension, connotations of discomfort as well, chafing. Mash up, smash up, break, destroy. I think also with connotations of celebration, of kind of storming in and partying. Um, I'm not 100% sure about that. Those might be more contemporary associations. And definitely the kind of primary sense is breaking stuff. Bun, burn, and mar, again, I'm not 100% sure. I think from the context that this means harm, injure, but through a brief session of Googling, I wasn't able to clarify that for sure. So if you know better, please let me know. It could potentially be more serious. It could maybe have a sense, a connotation of spoil, damage. And it strikes me that in the context of like protests, you often hear this word used in a particular way by the media, which is something like the mostly peaceful protest was marred by a few scuffles with the police. So a sense of like a nice day out being spoiled. And possibly that connotation is relevant here, although I'm pretty sure that the primary sense is just hurt, harmed, injured. Brixton, obviously an area of South London, which has for a long time, since the 1950s, since 1948, I guess, been home to African Caribbean communities. Babylon, so the police, Babylon means the police. It's a Rastafarian word. It's also, it derives from the city of Babylon in the Bible, which in the Old Testament, which in the New Testament becomes a metaphor for the Roman Empire as well. And the word Babylon in this usage here carries those connotations of empire, of a state power, of an establishment, and maybe of other forms of oppressive power, cultural oppression, social oppression. So I've said Babylon, the police, but also more broadly the system of Western colonialist capitalist domination. So the George, probably something you could guess from the context if you didn't already know, is a pub that burns down in this poem, a pub with a landlord who does not burn down. And pubs have often been centers of kind of front lines, I guess, of racist discrimination and anti-racist activism. And the George certainly was. So this was a notoriously racist landlord going back to at least the 1960s, round about the time that it was actually finally becoming illegal to discriminate against you in a pub, to refuse to serve you, or to kind of segregate you on the basis of your race. Around about that time, the George was the focus of anti-racist demonstrations, and was also reported after this law had come into effect. And I believe there was also a continued history of kind of racism surrounding this pub, and homophobia too. Swamp 81 was a police operation. This would be much more difficult, obviously, to gather from the context. It was a police operation. 81, that refers to the year 1981. Swamp 81 was a mass stop and search kind of police procedure, police operation, which involved, I think, nearly 1,000 stop and searches under this very terrible, I was going to say controversial, but this under this very terrible law, the Sus law, which we'll talk about in a moment, and resulting in, I think, around 80 arrests as well. It was a kind of plainclothes operation that also involved increased police presence. And Scarman, that's the name that refers to Lord Scarman, who was the guy that was appointed to head up the inquiry into these events afterwards. the official public inquiry. So here's a poem about some historical events. We focus in these videos on really kind of close reading, using the words of the poem themselves, not relying too much on secondary sources, on what critics and scholars have said. But this is definitely the kind of poem that benefits from some understanding of the historical context. So the Brixton Uprising, also known as the Brixton Riots and by various other names, took place between the 10th and 12th of April 1981. And the really short version is buildings and cars were burned, stores were looted, a lot of police officers and a few members of the public were injured. Nobody was killed, and I'm not sure if that figure is correct, actually, but I think, yeah, there were certainly some arrests. And of course, the broader context here is many decades of social, economic, institutional racism in all kinds of forms throughout British society, inequality, a fair degree of poverty and crime in this particular area, and specifically the Sus Law. So the Sus Law was actually originally a very old law. It was on the books since 1824. The 1824 Vagrancy Act, originally created in the aftermath of the Napoleonic War, basically to deal with demobbed soldiers flooding into London, but revived from the mid-1970s by the police, what for mostly to harass mostly young black men. So the thing about what this law allowed police officers to do was to arrest you if they suspected you of planning to commit a crime. So if they thought you were going to do something, they could drag you in. And by the late 1970s, early 1980s, largely through the efforts of black campaigners like Scrap Sus and other campaigners and activists as well, this law was already under review. So they were kind of considering changing it in some way. Scrap Sus obviously wanted more than just to have it repealed. They were after a much deeper reconsideration of how policing was done in the UK at that time. But although this law was being reviewed, although this law was being reviewed, it was used enthusiastically by the police at the beginning of April as part of Operation Swamp 81. So within 5 days, nearly 1,000 people were stopped and searched, and 82 were arrested. And soon enough, there were riots. So I don't want to get into a kind of blow-by-blow description of the historical context, partly because the poem is giving us its version of events, and I don't want to kind of preempt that. I think that's about enough historical context to understand how, the space in which the poem is speaking. So I'm going to, in a minute or two, end this video, and in the next video, we'll go through the poem bit by bit and explore what it's doing. But you might want to spend some time doing that yourself first. And I've offered some themes that I think might be quite interesting to explore. So the theme of information and disinformation, rumor, gossip, the grapevine, boasts and brags. The theme of history, how history gets written, whose voices count, whose voices sound the loudest, how do different voices interact, how do they cohere or fail to cohere. The poet's sympathies, the poet's attitudes towards the events depicted, and the people depicted. Address in the sense of who is this poem for? And I don't think any of these questions have kind of brief, easy answers. I think they're all open to kind of interesting debate. How does the poet construct his authority, his legitimacy? And the question of collateral damage. What is kind of morally acceptable accidental damage, destruction, violence that arises from accomplishing a desirable goal? That's an important theme in this poem. questions about celebration, revelry, partying, and vigilance, strategic vigilance, being aware, being alert. I've said daring deeds and tall tales. Think about that. Lived experience. So, are there certain kinds of things that you can only know from having been there, from having done something, from having had something done to you, from being in some kind of particular experientially rich situation? Does that produce certain kinds of knowledge that are non-transferable? You can't transfer that knowledge by writing it down, by teaching it to somebody else. Memory, closely linked with history. And I've also said the theme of spontaneity, things happening spontaneously, as opposed to things that are kind of pre-planned, is another interesting theme. And of course, violence is an important theme in this poem. So those are some things that you can think about, or you could think about different things, up to you. And yeah, I've noted down a few lines that I thought are particularly interesting that I'll probably pick up on in the next video. So you might want to look at some of those. And I'll leave it on the screen for a couple of seconds in case you want to pause it, but then I will finish this video. Okay, thank you. See you soon.